I never imagined I'd stand in the middle of a glittering ballroom, surrounded by hundreds of smiling faces, knowing full well that, by the end of the night, I wouldn't be anyone's wife. My name is Emily Hayes. I'm 27, and I grew up in a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona. My mom passed away when I was 12. My dad, he drowned himself in gambling debts and vanished before I even graduated high school. Since then, I've done whatever it took to survive, waitressing at diners, cleaning motel rooms, even handing out flyers on street corners in the scorching Arizona heat. I'm not the kind of woman people would call movie star beautiful, but I've always known how to carry myself with confidence. And I have something most people lack, an unshakable will. 3 years ago, I met Daniel Carter. He walked into the boutique hotel where I was working the night shift as a front desk clerk. Tailored suit, Rolex on his wrist, that effortless charm of someone who's never worried about rent a day in his life. But instead of treating me like part of the furniture, he spoke to me like I mattered. That night, I learned he was the only son of the Carter family, owners of one of the largest luxury hotel chains in the country. We came from two entirely different worlds. Still, Daniel made me believe that love could bridge any gap. At least, that's what I thought, until I met his mother. Margaret Carter is the kind of woman whose gaze could strip you bare in seconds. She sized me up in one glance, my off-the-rack blazer, my scuffed heels, and smiled politely before turning her attention to an upcoming charity gala. It wasn't hostility. Not yet. But I could feel it. The quiet, polite kind of disdain that only the truly wealthy have mastered. A week later, I overheard her speaking to Daniel in the kitchen, her voice smooth but razor sharp. Marrying is more than love, Daniel. It's about making the right alliance. And Emily doesn't come from the right place. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that if I was kind, respectful, and patient, she'd eventually accept me. But with every family dinner, every social event, every sideways glance, it became painfully clear, to Margaret, I would never be good enough. The turning point came on a Sunday evening. Daniel had invited me over for dinner at the Carter's estate in Scottsdale. Everything was as pristine and curated as a magazine spread, until dessert, when Margaret slid a thick white envelope across the table toward me. Her voice was sweet, almost tender. Emily, dear. This should help you start fresh somewhere else. Daniel deserves a life that matches his future. Inside was cash. A lot of it. I didn't touch it. I just smiled, pushed it back toward her, and said quietly, "Don't worry, Mrs. Carter. I have no intention of taking anything from your son. Except the truth." That night, lying awake in my small one-bedroom apartment, I stared at the mock-up of our wedding invitation sitting on my desk. And then, the idea struck me. If Margaret truly believed I was marrying Daniel for his money, I'd give her a wedding she'd never forget. A wedding that would make every mask slip, every hidden thought surface. A wedding that was never meant to end in vows. I didn't tell Daniel everything. He just thought I wanted a grand, glamorous ceremony. What I really wanted was a stage. And on that stage, I'd expose exactly who the Carters, and everyone else, really were when they thought no one was watching. And so, the performance began. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of fittings, tastings, and venue visits. On the surface, everything looked perfect. The kind of wedding you'd see on the cover of Brides magazine, white roses flown in from Italy, a 10-piece jazz band, a cake taller than I was. But underneath that polished perfection, there was something off. It started small. One afternoon, I was at the Carter estate reviewing the guest list with Daniel when Margaret strolled in, holding a crystal champagne flute like it was part of her hand. She leaned over my shoulder, scanning the names I'd been working on for hours. "You invited your old coworkers from the motel," she said, her smile tight. "They're my friends, I replied. Sweetheart, this is a black tie event. We don't want anyone feeling out of place. The words were sugar-coated, but I felt the sting. Translation: people like me didn't belong here. A few days later, I was meeting with the florist downtown when the boutique's owner pulled me aside. Miss Hayes, I'm a little confused. Someone from the Carter family called this morning and changed your entire order. They said you decided lilies instead of roses. I hadn't. When I confronted Daniel, he looked genuinely surprised and promised to straighten it out. But I didn't need a confession to know who had made the call. Margaret wasn't just trying to make her presence known, she was quietly rewriting my wedding. Then came the dress. My gown had been custom-made by a designer friend of mine from my waitress days, a gift I cherished because it was beautiful and mine. But when it arrived at the Carter house for safekeeping, I noticed something horrifying: the silk train had been altered. Shortened. The delicate embroidery along the hem, gone. It had been cut clean off. Must have been a misunderstanding at the tailor, Margaret said, sipping her tea as if nothing was wrong. By then, the warning bells in my head were deafening. She wasn't just testing me, she was trying to erase me from my own wedding. I told myself to let it go, to focus on Daniel and the day ahead. But ignoring Margaret became harder when I started receiving anonymous messages. Emails. Photos. Snippets of gossip from concerned acquaintances about how fast Daniel and I had gotten engaged, about the real reason I was marrying him. Every line dripped with accusation: gold digger, opportunist, social climber. One night, Daniel came over looking troubled. He sat on the edge of my bed, his hands clasped. Emily, I need to ask you something. Did you ever take money from my mother? It was like a punch to the stomach. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just stared at him and asked, do you actually believe that? He swore he didn't. But the hesitation, the way he paused before answering, told me everything I needed to know. That was the moment I stopped hoping things would work themselves out. If I was going to see this wedding through, I'd need to control the narrative. Every detail. Every reaction. And most importantly, every move Margaret made. Because this wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was a trap. And I was done playing the polite bride. The morning of my rehearsal dinner, I woke up to a call from the bank. Ms. Hayes, we've detected some unusual activity on your account. At first, I thought it was a scam. But then the banker's tone shifted, formal, precise, apologetic. Your balance has been depleted. Every cent was transferred to an offshore account yesterday afternoon. I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter. That's impossible. I didn't authorize anything. But deep down, I already knew. I drove to the bank in a daze, heart pounding against my ribs. The teller printed out the transaction record and slid it across the desk. My name was on the authorization form, but the signature wasn't mine. And the transfer? It had been initiated from the Carter estate's IP address. By the time I reached Daniel's office, my pulse was a roar in my ears. He was on a call, but when he saw my face, he hung up immediately. Emily, what happened? I told him. Every detail. His brow furrowed, but before he could say a word, Margaret stepped into the doorway. She didn't look surprised. She didn't even pretend to be. Daniel, perhaps we should talk privately, she said. No, I cut in. My voice was shaking, but my eyes didn't leave hers. If you have something to say, Mrs. Carter, say it here. She smiled, slow, cold, deliberate. I told you this life wasn't for you. Consider this. An early lesson. Marrying into our family isn't about love, Emily. It's about proving you can survive the weight that comes with it. Daniel stood there, silent. He didn't defend me. He didn't accuse her either. He just looked. Torn. And that was worse than any insult Margaret could throw at me. When I left the estate that night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even feel angry, not yet. What I felt was clarity. This wedding had started as a test for Margaret. Now, it was a war. That night, as I went through my phone, I found something. Buried in the bank statements, there was a tiny mistake, a payment made from the offshore account to a luxury travel agency. The reservation was under the name M. Carter. Not Margaret. Not even Mrs. Carter. Just M. Carter. And she'd booked it for the day after my wedding. I stared at the screen, a slow, dangerous smile curling at my lips. For weeks, she'd been pulling strings, convinced she was the one in control. But now, she handed me the thread I could use to unravel her. The wedding would go on. Every perfect flower, every note of music, every forced smile. And when the last champagne glass clinked, I'd pull the curtain back and make sure everyone saw the real Margaret Carter. 2 days before the wedding, I sat in my apartment surrounded by stacks of notes, screenshots, and neatly organized USB drives. Every lie Margaret had told, every manipulation, every transfer of money, I had it all. The travel booking in her name had been my starting point. From there, I traced the chain backward: shell companies, hidden accounts, a quiet transfer from the Carter Hotel's charity fund into a consulting firm that didn't exist. And guess whose signature appeared on the authorization forms? Margaret's. But this wasn't about exposing her to the authorities, not yet. That would come later. First, I needed the performance. I called the wedding planner and made a special request. I arranged for a projector to be set up in the reception hall, disguised as part of the decor. I told the band to take a longer break after the first dance. And I quietly tipped off a few influential guests, board members of Carter Hotels, Daniel's college friends, and even a local business reporter, that there might be a moment worth seeing during the reception. By the night of the wedding, everything was in place. The ceremony itself was a dream, at least, that's what everyone thought. Margaret looked smug in her silver gown, her hand resting on Daniel's arm like she'd personally orchestrated the union. I smiled for the cameras, my white satin dress gleaming under the lights, my hand steady. When we moved into the reception, the champagne flowed. The speeches were short, the music warm. But I could feel the weight of what was coming pressing against my ribcage. After the first dance, I took the microphone. "I just want to thank everyone for being here today," I began, my voice calm but loud enough to carry. "Weddings are about love, trust, and truth. And since we're all among friends here, I'd like to share a little truth tonight." The lights dimmed. The projector flickered to life. And there, on a 20-foot screen, appeared a slideshow: bank statements, transfer records, company documents, each one marked with Margaret's signature or email confirmation. Gasps rippled through the room. Margaret's face went pale, then flushed an angry red. "Emily, this is outrageous," she started, but I cut her off. "You tried to erase me from my own wedding, Mrs. Carter. You drained my bank account. You spread lies about me. But in doing so, you left a trail. A trail that doesn't just lead to me, but to Carter Hotel's charity funds. Which, by the way, the IRS might find very interesting." The room was silent except for the soft hum of the projector. Daniel stood frozen, his eyes darting between me and his mother. "You thought I was here to marry into your money," I said, stepping closer to Margaret. "But I'm here to show everyone exactly who you are when you think no one's watching." She tried to stand, but the whispers had already started, board members murmuring to each other, guests pulling out their phones, someone in the back snapping photos of the projected documents. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You thought you buried me, Margaret. Instead, you handed me the shovel." With that, I handed the microphone to the DJ, signaled the band, and walked off the dance floor, leaving her sitting in a room full of people who had just seen her entire facade crack wide open. I didn't look back. By the time I left the reception hall that night, I could already feel the shift. The air was heavy with whispers, and Margaret's name was no longer spoken with admiration, it was followed by suspicion. The next morning, I woke up to a barrage of messages. Screenshots from the local business journal. Headlines from industry blogs. Even a short clip of my truth speech circulating online, paired with the caption, "Bride exposes mother-in-law at wedding, and it's brutal." By the end of the week, Carter Hotel's board had called an emergency meeting. Margaret was temporarily relieved of her duties pending investigation. Which was corporate speak for, "She's done." The charity fund audit began almost immediately. I didn't have to push, it was already in motion the moment those documents went public. Word spread fast, and so did the questions. How long had the funds been mishandled? How much had disappeared? Who else was involved? As for Daniel, he came to see me 3 days later. No suit, no tie, just jeans and a wrinkled shirt, looking like he hadn't slept. "Emily, I didn't know," he said, his voice low. "But you didn't defend me either," I replied. "I wasn't cruel, just honest. When someone shows you who they are, Daniel, you believe them. That goes for your mother. And for you. We didn't fight. We didn't cry. We just let it end." And honestly, I felt lighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't working to prove myself to anyone. My bank account was still empty, but I had my own name, my own story, and I'd made sure Margaret Carter's reputation would never recover. A month later, I moved to Seattle. New city, new job, new life. I started working with a nonprofit that actually helped people, instead of pretending to. I made friends. I laughed again. But sometimes, when I pass a boutique wedding shop, I remember that night in the ballroom, the gasps, the silence, the moment Margaret realized she'd lost everything. And I smile. Because the best revenge isn't ruining someone in secret. It's doing it in a room full of people who once believed they were untouchable. So, if Margaret ever happens to see this, thank you. For teaching me the value of a good lawyer, a paper trail, and a damn good exit. And to everyone watching, remember this, you don't have to come from power to hold it in your hands. If you've ever been underestimated, betrayed, or told you weren't enough, I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments, because at a true moment's life, your voice matters. And if you don't want to miss more real stories that hit straight to the heart, make sure to subscribe. Every week, we share moments that remind us, truth is powerful. And so are you.